reduces the margin that the farmers are receiving in a lot of cases, while also increasing the cost for large agribusiness companies. And then large companies like the Cargills, General Mills, et cetera, that we're familiar with in town, on average they spend between 2 to 3% of their annual revenue on enterprise resource planning, so ERP costs alone. So brief introduction to blockchain and how we're looking to use this to build some bridges. Essentially, blockchain is a digital ledger technology. So it's a ledger in which transactions are stored publicly and chronologically on blocks on each node, and which is each unique computer participating in the same network. Now, in the case of enterprise cases, it can be servers, it can be in individual computers in offices, it can be on people's phones. It just depends on how the network setup is established and distributed. It often is centralized within the large organizations, but still decentralized across the whole network. So, quick data access. One of the other benefits of blockchain is quick data access. So, basically, the ability to give people access to very large amounts of data immediately and in real time that can be accessed across any number of the nodes extremely quickly. It's immutable. So once a transaction's consensus is reached, and this consensus, how that's determined, can be different based upon whoever created the or whatever network has created the protocol. Basically, what that means is there's a different way for agreement to come to say, hey, this transaction is valid on the network. Once this takes place and it's been reported, it can't be altered or changed. And then, like we had discussed, it's decentralized. So it's not on a central server, and identical records exist on each node of the chain with different levels of privacy. And so if someone corrupts a node or attempts to make a transaction, the other nodes basically develop a consensus to prohibit it in most cases. So in this case, we're just looking at a quick illustration. This is oversimplifying blockchain, but if we were to have only 4 different nodes on the network, so 4 different computers, for 4 different sets of transactions. Let's say one is the farmer, one is somebody who's delivering product, one is a mill, and then the last one is a transportation company. And each of them had a transaction, and there were no other network or transactions on the network. As they occurred chronologically, we would basically see a chain start to form. And then each of these chains represents basically the list of transactions on each separate computer. So everybody has a copy. And then in this case, we're just illustrating that you have quick access to the data. So if you're looking to pull up a transaction, you put in your information, and then it pulls up exactly what that transaction is. That is not how the supply chain works today, and we'll cover that in a moment. And then the other characteristic we just talked about is that blockchain is immutable. So if someone were to go in and try to make a change, and let's say this is somebody who's in an administrative office for the delivery company, it'll reject when the change is tried to be made because the other four nodes would have a copy of that transaction. So somebody can't just go in into an Excel spreadsheet and change what happened in the past. And then the decentralized nature also makes it so that somebody else who's acting nefariously can't go in and make changes as well. So what it is not. It's not a fundamental invention of new technology or concepts. It borrows core principles from accounting, cryptography, and computer network technology. So the way that it uses these technologies is innovative, but the blockchain itself is not. And then blockchain is not itself cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ether. So this is something that I come across a lot. People are assuming that because we're using blockchain in our business, we automatically have cryptocurrency attached to our business. In Verdethos' case, we don't. So that's very important. It's the underlying technology and not the currency itself. And then also, one thing that we hear often is that people are confused as to what the difference is between public and private blockchain. Not all information on blockchain has to be public. So there are different privacy settings and different types of protocols that allow for being able to create different levels of privacy at different rates of the chain. Okay, so this piece of it, so what we're looking at is right now, the supply chains are lacking clear transparency. What we're addressing in our business is that within the United States, Canada, the EU, and then Japan, and Australia is actually working on this now too, environmental and social data is going to be required up all the way across supply chains upstream. So they're talking about, like, if you have a truck that is moving goods from point A to point B, they're going to want the information on the environmental, social, and governance pieces. And then the scope 3 emissions are going to be extremely important to companies. So if you're with, let's say you're a company that's in the S&P 500, a very large business, you're already required to report scope 1 and 2. Now scope 3 is on the table for being required for reporting. And it looks like that's the direction the whole world is looking to go. And so in order to collect these data points, there's work that's being done on the ground throughout the world. But one of the biggest problems is being able to connect the dots across supply chains to understand where goods have come from. Now these data points don't necessarily have to go back to the individual supplier exactly to identify that supplier, but they at least have to be aggregated in the supply chains. So let's say I have 1,000 farmers that are selling to a middleman in a country at this point. What would likely be required is aggregate data from those 1,005 farmers in a reliable way, being reported to the middleman, and then the middleman reporting their data, and that's the farmer's data, and the transportation data, all the way up through the companies like ADM, et cetera. So what we're looking to do is basically use blockchain technology as the underlying reporting ledger to move the data across the supply chain. And it's actually very important to note that it will depend upon the privacies required by each of those companies, how much gets passed, and whether it's aggregated data or individual data. So just skipping ahead a little bit here, just to be cognizant of time. So right now, this is the process that someone goes through in order to find a shipping container. So this is another issue that we're looking to solve for. So if there's a shipping container that's lost somewhere in the middle of the ocean, right now, folks are calling all around the world to try to figure out where was the last place that it was. Now, there was research done 4 years ago on trying to figure out product recall timing, and it would take about 7 days to determine the original source and the places that may have been contaminated for a bin of lettuce. If we have things connected where we can see the path in real time, they're able to make those decisions extremely rapidly and in real time be able to pull up the path of that contaminated batch of lettuce, and then also other containers that may have come and been cross-contaminated in a very timely manner, so that we're not wasting time and also not throwing out significant amounts of lettuce and other produce that may or may not have actually come in contact with it. And so the future of efficiency, instead of that, is basically as soon as a transaction takes place, all of the relevant information goes up onto the database, and then it's shared across the full network. So 5 key benefits. So looking at these individual cases, we touched on enhanced trust already. So it's that the data can't actually be reversed. This can help with a shift in power dynamics. One use case that I've seen for this is that in Latin America, there's a very large company that's based in the US that has cocoa and sugarcane being pulled from Latin America and then parts of Africa. And they also decided that in order to be able to better trace this environmental, social, and governance data, they would start cutting out the small farmers and then only buy from their medium to large size farmers, because it cuts down the amount of data points they actually have to collect, and they realized it would be very difficult to map out the small farmers. What that has done is that region needed to still be able to supply the amount of cocoa and sugarcane that is needed by this very large chocolate or candy manufacturer. And so crops were being laundered from the small farmers to the mid-sized farmers. That meant that the small farmers were getting about 40 cents on the dollar that they were getting before, which was already less than they likely should have been getting to begin with, to supply to through the same supply chains as before, but the crops were being laundered. And so the data points were less, but the crops were coming from the same place. And this happens all over the world, and people lose generational land. And so that has become a significant problem. My passion point and why I do what I do is when talking with a lot of these farmers, it's how do we use basically the requirement of, hey, let's take better care of the environment, let's take better care of the people here on Earth, and let's find a better way to trace it. So those are the 3 tenets of ESG. That's the reason why they're requiring this data. So my interest in that is very much so, if we're saying that we're doing all these things to better help the world, then how does it help to have these smaller farmers push out their land in the name of collecting the data that then is being reported? Right. So rather than that being the case, we're very interested in how do you create highways for the data to flow on that are reliable and efficient and scalable, so that that doesn't take place in the same way. And just instead of there being, you know, like it's basically to cut down on the excuses as to why folks decide not to do right by people. So that's my personal interest in it. Additionally, like the better transparency piece of it, companies can decide how to incentivize their suppliers and logistics companies' behaviors. And so with that, if there's a better way to be able to understand the ESG data from everybody that is supplying to you, you also know who can I be actually spending money on as a large organization to help them transition over to practices that would actually boost my ESG score because they're better for the environment and better for the community that I'm serving. Or not serving, but purchasing from. And then reducing cost. Another use case that we're looking at is in using IoT devices and the data capture being immutable. Are there ways to enhance trust to cut out third-party validators such as graders, surveyors, and then also are there ways to reduce middlemen where they're not necessary? And then the other piece, the traceability piece, one thing that we're seeing that's very common are people using this on like luxury goods to detect fraud or like organics, so if people are laundering organics. But luxury goods, I've seen cases with wine. So if it's like extremely valuable bottles of wine and you put only 1,000 bottles out into the system, being able to have each of them tagged with a unique identifier as they flow through the system. Not only the bottle changes hands, but an NFT is created to move with the bottle of wine. And so that's very common with luxury goods at this point. There are several different companies that have started to implement that, not just in agriculture, but across other luxury brands like Louis Vuitton. And then the improved efficiency piece, we already had discussed that it's very helpful for the contamination recalls and lost items. So plan